Hey, life group leaders, let me ask you a question. Why do we so quickly desert him who has delivered us? I mean, think about it. The human heart is incredibly sinful and yet wildly fickle and therefore capable of astounding inconsistency. Think back in the Old Testament. What does God do? He saves his people, right? He saves his people and they walk through the sea on dry ground. He crushes their enemies. And what do they do in Exodus 32? They turn to man-made idols. And then you come to the New Testament in the book of Galatians, right? And what has God done? God has saved his people by giving up his son as a sacrifice in their place. And what do? They turn to man-made gospels. And then I think about you and me. What do? God has saved us, and we turn so often to an infinite number of lesser things that are unworthy of our attention and unworthy of our affection. We transfer our allegiance to that which cannot save us, to that which cannot sustain us. We turn from the gospel, and as a result, we turn from God. See, we're beginning a new study in the book of Galatians this week, and as we begin, I think it is essential that we consider the context. Paul is writing, first and foremost, he's writing to a group, he's writing to the church at Galatia in response to a group that is known as the Judaizers. And the Judaizers are confusing Paul's converts in Galatia by adding to Paul's message. See, this is what they're saying. They're saying that these Gentile Christians in Galatia, that they must be circumcised, that they got to follow all these Jewish dietary laws, and they've got to keep all of the Jewish law in order to be accepted by God. And if you read this passage and you pay attention to Paul's tone, you're going to tell that Paul is furious. See, these Judaizers have come in and they have shaken things up. Right? They are distorting the gospel. And Paul knows that to distort the gospel is to trouble the church. And the devil, let me tell you, church, the devil disturbs the church as much by error as he does by evil. In verse 7, Paul says this. He says that the Judaizers are perverting the gospel. And that word pervert is an interesting word. It literally means to reverse. And I don't want us to miss this. See, if we revise the gospel, if we adjust the gospel in any way, if we revise the gospel, we reverse the gospel. When we add to the gospel, we subtract from the gospel. Why? Because the Judaizers are basically saying that you, Galatians, you must finish the unfinished work of Christ. But here's the deal. If the work of Christ on the cross is incomplete, then Jesus is insufficient to save. Then the life, then the death, and the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus was all for nothing. And that's not Paul's message. So you look at verse 4, what does Paul say? Paul says that Jesus gave himself for our sins to rescue us. And that word rescue implies two things. It implies that we are both hopeless and lost. And here's the deal. Imagine this. If you see someone who's drowning, you don't throw them a manual on how to swim. What do? No, you jump in and you try to save them, right? See, we don't need good advice. We don't need good teaching. What we need is rescuing. Because as we're going to see later in Galatians, we are enslaved to sin. And Jesus is first and foremost, before anything else, Jesus is our rescuer, because that is what we most need, because we cannot save ourselves. And I think the most shocking thing for us to remember as we consider the context in the book of Galatians is that this letter was written to Christians, not non-Christians. Paul was writing to the church at Galatia. And last week we said this. We said that salvation is not the finish line, it's the starting line. So this week, what I want you to do, I want you to help your life group understand that we never outgrow our need for the gospel. The gospel is not just the ABCs of Christianity, but the gospel is the A to the Z. Christians need the gospel just as much as non-Christians. The gospel is not only that which saves us, the gospel is that which sustains us. Hey, if you have any additional thoughts or questions, reach out to me. I'd love to follow up and chat more with you. I'm praying for you as you have a great life group this week. Y'all be blessed.